Win one for the Gipper. It's one of the most iconic lines in American sports and political history. But before it was a rallying cry, it was a dying wish. Before it was a Hollywood punchline or presidential slogan, it belonged to George Gipp, a pool shark from Michigan's Upper Peninsula who became Notre Dame's first football superstar and whose legend only grew after his tragic death. Gipp was born on February 18th, 1895, in the frozen copper mining town of Laurium, Michigan, way up on the Keweenaw Peninsula. As a boy, Gipp was tall, quiet, and mischievous, equal parts mystery and prankster. He skipped class, talked back to teachers, and pulled elaborate stunts. From the book One for the Gipper, George Gipp, Knute Rockne, and Notre Dame by Patrick Chelland, published in 1973. One of his school friends remembers a story that had as its root the Eggen and Hoyam's Swedish bake shop located on Hecla Street, a few doors down from the Gipp residence. The owners of the shop had hauled out several dozen cases of eggs and stacked them alongside the building. Along came George, wearing a heavy corduroy jacket with deep pockets. Spotting the eggs, he sauntered over, broke open one of the crates, and carefully filled his pockets. Then he walked along Hecla Street, stopping everyone he knew, and engaged them in idle conversation. As they chatted, George surreptitiously slipped an egg into each friend's pocket. Then, abruptly terminating the conversation, he slapped the person in the area of the deposited egg. George counted 12 victims in less than an hour. One friend described him as a young stallion who hated being fenced in. But he was also brilliant at everything he tried. He could outrun, outthrow, and outthink almost everyone. As a kid, he was already a sensation on local baseball fields. Chelland says of him, he could hit, field, and run the bases with the skills of one of the great stars of his day, Tyrus Raymond Cobb. On the amateur diamonds of his hometown, they did, in fact, call him the next Ty Cobb. Unlike Cobb, however, he packed a Ruthian wallop. Gipp graduated high school and then spent the next couple years without a plan. He worked part-time construction, part-time hustling, living in pool halls, and other places of ill repute. By chance, a traveling Notre Dame baseball team scooped up a couple of his friends, and one of them told him to head to South Bend, and he'll make sure to get him a scholarship to play baseball. Football wasn't even on the radar. That changed when Knute Rockne, then an assistant coach, saw Gipp messing around, drop-kicking footballs 50 yards in street clothes. Rockne watched him for 10 minutes, and then he asked his name, whether he played high school football, and why he's at Notre Dame. Gipp answers him with indifference, but Rockne convinced him to try out for the football team. In Gipp's first year, 1916, he is restricted from playing varsity because of a rule restricting freshmen. But they still played football against other schools. In a story by Rockne in Collier's Weekly, November 22nd, 1930, we get an early glimpse of Gipp's greatness as a freshman. Gipp insisted that he be allowed to try for a kick and win 3 points and the game. His quarterback and captain argued against it. The quarterback called for a punt, as a matter of fact, to get the ball out of his own territory and make sure of a draw when a win seemed impossible. Gipp took the ball and dropped back to his own 38-yard line. With effortless grace, he dropped the ball, booted it, and it soared high and away, parting the square of space above the crossbar. A perfect bid for the 3 points that won the game. Gipp joined the Notre Dame varsity squad in 1917, right as American football was evolving from a bruising ground game into something more dynamic. Gipp was built for this transition. He was a triple threat, a fluid runner, a pinpoint passer, and the finest drop kicker of his generation. He once nailed a 62-yard drop kick, still one of the longest ever in college football. Gipp could throw a 50-yard pass with ease in an era when the football was fat and hard to grip. He ran the 100-yard dash in 10.2 seconds in full pads. He could punt 60 yards on the fly and kick field goals from midfield. On defense, he rarely tackled a ball carrier head on, preferring to herd them to the sideline like a sheepdog. But when he did hit, it was vicious and deadly, Rockne later stated. What made him special wasn't just skill, it was intuition. Rockne called it a kind of sixth sense, a football IQ you couldn't teach. In a 1917 game against Army, the cadets lined up for a field goal with Notre Dame leading 7-2. From Rockne of Notre Dame, The Making of a Football Legend by Ray Robinson, published in 1999. When the West Pointers set up for a place kick, Gipp, a Euclidean genius when it came to calculating dice odds, quickly figured out a successful place kick would still leave Army trailing 7-5. Thus he surmised that Army was going to fake the kick and throw the ball. As the play got underway, he yelled, "Watch out for the pass!" And sure enough, Army's quarterback hurled the ball into the end zone where the alert Gipp knocked it to the ground. Notre Dame's slim victory had been preserved. He was Notre Dame's first national superstar. At a time when Eastern schools like Yale, Harvard, and Penn dominated the sport and the press, Gipp forced the country to pay attention to a small Catholic college in Indiana. In March 1920, Gipp is expelled from Notre Dame, the school apparently tired of him flaunting all the regulations. Gipp is sought by many teams in the country, and it's stated that he had an appointment to West Point had he wanted it. Army was a powerhouse at the time, but Rockne rallied the business people in South Bend, and President James Burns reinstated him in April. Gipp's most famous game came that same year, October 30th, 1920, at West Point. Notre Dame was unbeaten, but Army was a national power. Gipp's exploits before the game were told in Notre Dame Football, the story of a proud heritage by Jim Beach, published in 1962. The night before the Army game, Gipp went into Island Falls, New York, the small village outside the South Gate at West Point. He headed for the local gamblers' hangout, Matt Ryan's pool room. He took a stick and practiced a while, and then innocently inquired about the odds on the game. Before the night was over, he had taken all the action around, covering the bets with a bag full of money South Benders had given him for that purpose. While Army and Notre Dame were warming up before the game, fans saw an unforgettable demonstration of drop kicking. Russell Red Reeder, the cadet kicking specialist, and Gipp matched kick for kick until moving far back to the 40-yard line. Reeder retired to the sideline. Gipp sauntered to the midfield stripe and called for 4 footballs. He boomed 2 kicks over one crossbar and, turning around, did the same at the opposite end of the field. 4 perfect 50-yard drop kicks that tingled the spines of those who appreciated the beauty of Gipp's performance. In front of 10,000 cadets, Gipp dazzled, running, passing, punting, and drop kicking his way to a 27-17 upset. When he finally left the field, battered and bleeding, the West Point crowd gave him a silent standing ovation. Grantland Rice, the era's most famous sports writer, was in the stands and later called Gipp one of the greatest he'd ever seen. But George Gipp was more than a football marvel. Off the field, he was a paradox. He could be aloof, sarcastic, and mysterious, yet also generous and kind. He gambled on pool and poker, rarely went to class, and never read newspaper articles about himself. He didn't chase stardom, it followed him. He hated posing for photos. He left no interviews. No film exists of him playing. But somehow his legend just kept growing. Notre Dame's season ended on November 25th with a 25-0 win over Michigan Agricultural, now known as Michigan State. The Irish finished the season 9-0, but Gipp didn't play in the game as he had checked into the St. Joseph's Hospital in South Bend with a cold and a fever of 104 degrees. It was while he was in the hospital that Gipp was named Notre Dame's first consensus All-American, breaking into Walter Camp's elite list and opening the door for the Four Horsemen and others to follow. Unfortunately, Gipp had a throat infection that worsened into pneumonia and then staph sepsis. Antibiotics didn't exist yet. And then suddenly, as he had arrived, Gipp was gone. On December 14th, 1920, George Gipp died at just 25 years old. The country mourned. Sports pages ran tributes. Former opponents wrote letters of condolence. A candle had gone out at the peak of its glow, but George Gipp's story wasn't over. In the final days of his life, he reportedly told Rockne, "Sometime, Rock, when the team is up against it, when things are going wrong and the breaks are beating the boys, ask them to go in there with all they've got and win just one for the Gipper. I don't know where I'll be then, Rock, but I'll know, and I'll be happy." For years, Rockne kept the story private, but then came 1928. Notre Dame was having a down season. They limped into Yankee Stadium to face a heavily favored Army team. At halftime, the score was 0-0. Rockne had waited 8 years for the right moment. In the cramped locker room under the stadium, he told his team the story of Gipp's final days. He ended with, "This is the day, and you are the team. Go out there and win one for the Gipper." Players returned to the field like men possessed. Notre Dame pulled off a shocking 12-6 upset. After scoring the go-ahead touchdown, Jack Civini stood up and said, "That's one for the Gipper." Now, there is some question as to whether or not George Gipp actually stated the "win one for the Gipper" line to Rockne on his deathbed. Rockne's widow, Bonnie, was asked whether it was true, to which she responded, "Yes, it was true, and word for word, it was in Rock's diary." 12 years later, Hollywood took over the legend of George Gipp and blew it up bigger than ever. Ronald Reagan played Gipp in the 1940 Warner Brothers film Knute Rockne, All-American. Though Reagan only appeared in a handful of scenes, the role would follow him for the rest of his life. As the dying Gipp, Reagan delivered the film's emotional high point. "Rock, tell them to go out there with all they've got and win just one for the Gipper." It was just a movie line, but it became part of Reagan's identity. When Reagan entered politics decades later, he fully embraced the concept of the Gipper. Supporters began using it as a nickname. Campaign banners and buttons read, "Win one for the Gipper." Reagan himself used the phrase in stump speeches and interviews. It became shorthand for American grit, courage, and optimism. During his presidency, Reagan would invoke the Gipper story in some of the most emotional and patriotic moments. Gipp's name was known in households that had never watched college football. What started as a locker room pep talk had become a political rallying cry, a symbol of American perseverance. Through Reagan's presidency, the Gipper lived again, not just in sports, but in national mythology. And it's no wonder Reagan embraced the character of George Gipp. It's because Gipp's story is so uniquely American. A brilliant talent from a small town no one has heard of, a rebel, a reluctant hero, a man who died young but left behind something eternal. Gipp played in just 32 games. He never lost to Army or Navy. He still holds Notre Dame's all-time record for average yards per play over a career. He never had a pass completed against him in all the years he played football, and yet he is remembered not for stats, but for a moment, a line, a feeling. 100 years have passed, and we're still talking about George Gipp. In a world that now measures greatness by the algorithm, Gipp reminds us that myth still matters. He was the first Notre Dame star. He was the Gipper. Gipp's story is college football history, myth, and legend. What strikes me about it is how little embellishment it requires to reach legendary status. So many of our stories of legends of the past, whether sports figures or not, are exaggerated to create myth. Was Billy the Kid the fastest gun in the West? It didn't matter. He sold a lot of dime store novels. Gipp needs none of that embellishment. His accomplishments were his own. Adding to his tragedy is how he died. A sore throat, pneumonia, illnesses we mostly take for granted today. Sadly, that may not have made a difference. In his book, Chelan points out that Gipp had made a trip to see a doctor earlier before he'd gone into the hospital, complaining of shortness of breath and swelling of the ankles. After a preliminary examination, Dr. Roche, his doctor, discovered that George's blood pressure was 180 over 110, an alarmingly high reading for a young man. These symptoms, shortness of breath, pedal edema, and hypertension, no doubt had been brought on by a case of rheumatic fever during childhood that had gone undetected. At this point, the symptoms indicated congestive heart failure, the prognosis for which was extremely poor. This is to say that George Gipp, had he not contracted a streptococcal infection, still had only a very short time to live. It's as if Gipp were doomed to be a brief, bright candle in the world, used up and extinguished before he could relish the rewards of his achievements. This is John Johnston with Hardcore College Football History. Thank you.